we're also streaming online, and we have some online participants, which is why we also have a camera in front of us as well. So really quickly, I want to introduce Orvan, who's the site director here at the Family Justice Center, who will introduce herself and a little bit about the center.
Hi, good morning and welcome. Welcome. Thank you for being with us this morning. My name is Orvan. I'm the site director here at the West Contra Costa Family Justice Center. We have 2 sites right now, one in Concord, and we have another one coming up that will open up the end of this summer. And our work and our main focus of work is to assist victims of families affected by domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, elder abuse, and child abuse. And we do that by bringing public agencies and private partners, nonprofits, all in one place to create a hub for families seeking resources. And if you have any further questions, please come and talk to me. You'll see me walking around later during your break or after your training. And let's see, parking, you're fine in our parking lot, and if you're on the side street, you're fine as well all day to the left of the hallway. Thank you.
And they can come find you if they want a tour later. Awesome. Thank you, Orvan. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so today's training is actually part of a resilience series that Strategies 2.0, the Bay Area Learning Communities has been facilitating. And so this is our 3rd and final for at least this fiscal year that we're hosting. The previous 2, and just to sort of do some context setting, some of you all might be familiar with the series already, but we did the previous 2 events in this past year, in the past couple of months actually, really just focus on not just ACEs and resilience, but with a race and equity lens. Because when we're talking about adverse childhood experiences, we have to recognize that there are cultural considerations as well, right? Considerations in terms of historical oppression, systemic trauma, all of these things that factor into a child and family's experiences. So we really wanted to lift those stories up, and we brought a variety of speakers in, and today we'll have Taquelia Washington come and talk to us today about cultural trauma. So like I mentioned, we do have some online participants. Hence, again, that's why the camera is right in front of us, and this is why we have a microphone. And so if anybody has questions or comments, we're going to hand the microphone to you just so that our online participants can hear you. And again, it's not amplified, so please still project your voice while you're talking. And of course, here at Richmond is the hub site. Oftentimes with learning communities, we have remote sites as well. For this event, we don't, but it's a way for us to broaden our reach for the learning communities and have physically accessible sites in other locations in the Bay Area region. So a little bit about Strategies 2.0 in case folks aren't familiar with the organization. So we're a statewide organization, and Michael, feel free to jump in anytime if you want to say anything about Strategies 2.0. He's the director, co-director of the organization. So Strategies 2.0, again, is a statewide organization that's dedicated to supporting professionals in the family strengthening field. So essentially what that means is that we support folks who are doing this type of work in all different venues, and this might be in the Family Resource Center venue, this might be in child welfare, this might be in child abuse prevention. So it's a whole myriad of services and supports that we have. And we provide free services all across the state of California in the context of training, consultation, organizational development, networking, learning community spaces like this. What's really different about learning communities, distinct from, say, if you go to like a didactic training, is that we really want to engage folks in conversation and safe spaces where we can meet other folks in the field and spend time with them and break bread, with them and have meaningful conversations. And so that's the distinction that we make in terms of what the learning communities are. So please stay connected with us. You can go online to our website. Sign up for our newsletter to be apprised of upcoming learning communities. We are thinking about potentially expanding on this race and equity series, or even thinking about talking about some of the larger child abuse prevention work that's going on in the county. So stay tuned, and you can, of course, register for the trainings online or register for learning communities online as well. And of course, our project is funded by the Office of Child Abuse Prevention. So one thing I do want to lift up is that we're always trying to find out what types of learning opportunities a community is wanting. What are you craving? And what kind of spaces make sense for you all. And so every year we send out a survey to participants or people who have been connected to our work in some way. Last year, our survey response rate was pretty low. It was only at 10%. However, a good chunk of those folks did say they gained or implemented skills, tools, or knowledge that they utilized in the field. So you're going to see another survey come out in July. So please look out for it and participate. We really want your feedback. And we take that feedback seriously and we incorporate it into our planning for the next fiscal year. So this is our agenda for today. We did the welcome. I'm going to have folks just really quickly do introductions. And again, this is really about getting to know who's in the room and being inspired by all the work that we do in our communities. We'll have our guest speaker speak. She's going to create space for some Q&A, and then we'll close. So pretty simple. Okay. Before we get to that, I'm just going to have the microphone go around really quickly, name an organization, just because I want to get through everybody before we delve into a little small activity. So quickly, name an organization.
My name is Lydia Benson White. I'm with the Center for Youth Wellness in San Francisco.
Hi, my name is Justin Jarrett, and I'm with the Contra Costa Crisis Center for the Help Me Grow program.
My name is Robert Preston. I'm with CCYCS.
My name is Denise. I'm with CCYCS.
Kimberly Palacios, also from CCYCS.
Good morning. I'm Crystal Bannigan with Girls Inc.
Sandra Rodriguez with Contra Costa Youth Services, which is CCY.
Marianne Dawkins with Fairfield Police Department.
Marquita Fields, Solano County Homeless Outreach.
Hello, I'm Lana Callisto with Strategies 2.0, also the camera person.
Hello, I'm Bryn Pascal with Strategies 2.0.
Hi, I'm Angelica Delgado with Yes Nature to Neighborhoods.
Hi, my name is Kathleen Suddiff, and I'm from the Bay Area Rescue Mission Center for Women and Children.
Hi, I'm Michael Williams. I'm with Strategies 2.0.
Hi, I'm Blanca Delgado with the Child Abuse Prevention Council.
And I'm Carol Carrillo with the Child Abuse Prevention Council, Contra Costa.
I'm Chris Murphy from the Center for Innovation and Resources in Sonoma County.
I am Sequita from Resources for Community Development.
Good morning. My name is Alicia Elliott with Resources for Community Development.
Tiffany Harris with Girls Inc. of West Contra Costa County.
Good morning. My name is Nikki Singleton, Teen Success Inc. Through Milpitas, California.
Good morning. My name is Diana Kinlow. I'm with Hamilton Families.
Good morning. I'm Beth Hoke. I'm from First 5 Alameda County.
That's it. So we're going to pause to see if anybody online wants to introduce themselves. And you'll notice we're going to do this throughout the event. Nobody? Does anybody online want to say a brief hi? Name an organization? Or type in. Sorry, technical difficulties. We went ahead and unmuted you, so if you'd like to say hi, you're more than welcome, or you can just type into the chat box.
Good morning. We're from Pittsburgh Unified School District, MTSS specialists.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Any other folks?
For those that typed in, we have Amanda from Tulare County, CAPC. We have Najib from Santa Cruz County Family and Children's Services. April Long from Hamilton Families. Amitai Padilla from Pittsburgh Unified School District, MTSS specialist. Great. So thank you to those that wrote in, and if anyone else would like to speak up, Go ahead.
Thanks, Bryn. So Bryn will, for the online folks, Bryn will be your voice. So feel free to chat, and she'll wave us down. Sorry to put you on the spot. Do you want to briefly introduce yourself, name and organization?
My name is Lucinda Guyer. I am the site supervisor at Kelly House.
Thank you. Okay. So we're just going to do a brief activity. Folks are sort of already in these small group spaces. So if you can just turn to your neighbor and perhaps briefly introduce yourself again, and just talk about what inspired you to attend this convening. And for the online folks, if you want to chat your thoughts, feel free to do so, and we'll share with a broader group. Oh. On the left. All right, so it looks like folks are sort of closing their conversations as we can get back together as a group. I'm glad people are so inspired. They're still talking. Oh, so it's so I explained this in the beginning. This is for the online participants. Yeah, so that they can hear us, but it's not amplified. I know it's weird. Yeah, it's weird because I'm talking into it and you still can't hear me. I know, right? Yeah. So we're gonna start back together. Okay, so we're gonna start getting back to the bigger group. I'm glad there's so much good energy in this room. All right, so really quickly, we're gonna just do a popcorn style. If anybody wants to share something that inspired them or something that you heard from a colleague that inspired them and you want to share with their permission. You all were so energized with each other. Well, let's, a few folks actually typed in online, so I'm gonna have Bryn read those responses aloud.
Great, yeah, I want to thank the online audience for their participation and engagement. So Najib says that they are looking to enhance our understanding, collaboration, resources around child abuse prevention, and this topic is a critical piece for us to look at, ACEs and racial disparities. And Amatai, I'm so sorry if I'm pronouncing anyone's name wrong, shared that we would like to learn more about ways to support students and their families and to better understand them. The nature of our work, being support staff and making sure that students receive resources on and off campus, made them want to understand ACEs more to help with finding students who might fall under the radar that need support. So great, thank you.
Great, thanks everyone. So like I mentioned, we want this to be a conversation, so feel free to jump in at any time if you have any musings, inspirations to share with the broader group. I did forget to mention, just sort of as a local plug, that this particular Bay Area Learning Communities is organized in partnership with the Contra Costa Child Abuse Prevention Center. And so if you folks want to get more involved, Carol just stepped out, but she was sitting right there. So yeah, feel free to look for Carol if you want to get more connected locally. So we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm just checking the guest speakers here. I'm going to introduce you to Taquelia. They were just chatting in the hallway. Okay, so it's my pleasure to introduce Taquelia Washington, our guest speaker for today.
Everyone, I'm just going to pause for one quick second. So this is the camera.
Correct, yeah.
Okay.
And this is for the online, that's why it's not amplified, you still have to project.
Gotcha. And then the folks in the back right here, if people have like questions, perfect. Okay, good. All right. Okay, I think that'll be good if we can do that. Yeah, okay.
This is on and off, so I'll go ahead and turn it on.
Okay, is that good? All right. All right. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. So my name is Taquelia Washington, and I'm going to be presenting for you today. Our topic this morning is going to be about talking a lot about trauma. In particular, we're going to be talking about trauma from the cultural perspective. So we're going to be talking about like what is trauma, what are the different types of trauma, but we're going to be focusing in on what are the types of traumas that we experience based on specifically our cultural identities. From there, we're going to move into looking at symptoms of trauma, and then we're going to look at like trauma-informed care and what can we as providers do when we're working with communities that have experienced a lot of trauma. To help us get started, I'm wanting to just do a little bit of an opening. As you already know, when we talk about trauma, it can get really heavy. one of the things that we are going to be talking about is that for us, even as service providers, we also experience trauma just by the nature of doing work with people that have experienced trauma. And so one of the things that I like to do just to get us started is just to do a little bit of a self-reflection for ourselves to give us something to root into as we go throughout our presentation for today. So what I'm going to be asking you to do for this opening is to think about for yourself personally, when you're feeling really stressed or when you're feeling really overwhelmed, what is one thing that you can do to help to bring a little bit of relief to yourself? So when you're feeling really stressed or when you're feeling really overwhelmed, what is one thing that you can do or that you do to help you to feel a little bit better? I'm going to give you a moment to think about that on your own, and then I'm just going to have you do a quick pair share with someone that's sitting around you, and I'll give you about 2 minutes to do that. So now just to give you a moment to think about what your answer is. So I'm going to ask you to turn to the person next to you or people next to you, and if you can just spend a couple of moments sharing about what that one thing is that helps you to feel a little bit better when you're feeling stressed. So just one more moment. All right, just about 10 more seconds, 10 more seconds. All right, I'm going to ask everyone to wrap up. I'm going to ask everyone to wrap up their conversations. I need my timer, my dinger. Was everyone able to come up with an answer? Raise your hand if you were able to come up with at least one answer. Perfect, perfect, good, good, good. So part of what we're doing with that exercise is we're starting to allow our minds to think from a strength-based perspective. We're starting to allow our minds to give us something to root into when times are feeling really stressful or overwhelming, which isn't necessarily exactly what trauma is, but in part, that is part of what happens when we experience trauma. And so I just want to invite you to hold on to what that one thing was. And as you may start to feel stress or overwhelmed, even if we're having our conversation today, try to use that as something that you can root into. And that's part of what we're also trying to do with the communities or the people that we're working with in the community, to try to also help them to find their inner resiliency as something that they can use to root into as part of their healing process. So just actually a couple more things. Feel free to jump in if you have questions or comments as I'm talking. I tend to be pretty informal, so I have a lot of information that I want to share with you. But if you have questions, don't feel like you have to wait to the end. jump in, or if you want to add anything from your professional or personal experience, feel free to do that as well. I also have some more dyad or small group exercises or reflections that we're going to be doing, and I have some questions that I'll be asking you as well. We'll take a 15-ish minute break at around 10:30, so that'll be our natural pausing point. So just jumping in, so thinking about it from a larger perspective, what is trauma? So from the largest, trauma is used to describe experiences or situations that are emotionally painful and distressing and that overwhelm people's ability to cope, leaving them to feel powerless. So that's a very broad definition of trauma. It's also really important to note that trauma doesn't occur firsthand. We're going to be talking about ways that you can experience trauma even if you weren't the person that experienced that exact same scenario or that exact same situation. From a public health perspective is that almost everyone, if not everyone, has experienced some form of trauma. So as a provider, if you were to use that assumption that everyone that you work with has experienced some form of trauma, from a public health perspective, that would actually be an accurate statement. And it actually starts to like paint a picture of how sad it is when we start to talk about trauma, that in our society, trauma is so prevalent that no one escapes it. So as we're starting to talk, what I'm going to be doing is adding layers to trauma. Most people that we're working with in the community haven't just experienced one layer of trauma. Most of the people that we're working with have experienced layer on top of layer on top of layer of traumatic experiences. And the type of interventions that we use when someone has experienced multiple layers different than the type of interventions that we use with someone that has just experienced one trauma. So as I'm going through these slides, the image that I have in my head is almost like an onion, where we're just adding layers on top of layers on top of layers. So one of the more foundational layers of trauma starts with what we now know as the ACEs. Many of you probably are familiar with ACEs by now. And what the ACEs does is it breaks down traumatic and adverse experience that happen in childhood. Those experiences that happen in childhood are as follows. Children that experience physical violence, sexual violence, emotional, physical neglect, emotional neglect, mother treated violently, substance misuse within household mental illness, parental separation or divorce, incarcerated household and member. So this right here isn't a complete list of traumatic experiences, but what research has done is research has studied children who have experienced these set of criteria, and what they found is that from this list, the more that you have experienced from this list in childhood, there is a direct correlation with a lot of different health ailments that happen in adulthood. And so from a medical model, medical are now starting to look at the ACEs as a foundational part of their medical model. At least that's what we're trying to go toward. We're not there yet, because they're finding that correlation, that when people have experienced multiple of these, that there's a direct correlation to health ailments in adulthood. There's a lot of information out there about ACEs, and so I encourage you to look into it. It's actually really good, and what we want to know about ACEs is that as we're talking about the multiple layers of trauma, we can see that this list is also really limiting, right? There's a lot of other traumatic experiences that people have experienced that aren't listed here. And so there's, in addition to like the studies that have been done on ACEs, there's also some complexity that's now being added to ACEs. We're starting to recognize that, yes, these foundational childhood experiences are really important, but in addition to that, there's lots of other layers of experience that people go through in life, including what we're going to be talking about today, those specifically related to cultural experiences that add on to this foundational trauma layer that we're talking about. What we know about cultural identity in particular about racial identity, is that in and of itself, being a racial minority in the society has explicit forms of trauma related to it. And so we cannot look at a list like this in isolation. We can't look at a list like this and not look at racial identity. We can't look at a list like this and look at what communities are people being raised in and brought up in. We can't look at a list like this and not talk about poverty. There's all of these other nuanced layers to what create traumatic experiences in our world. And so I'm not going to I wanted to just pose it to you so that you can see the layers that people are starting to add. I think there's a citation in your slide, so if you're interested in reading more about this is actually done by a local organization. They have an article that talks more detailed about it, but just in general, the visual aid starts to help you to look at like the complexity of what we're talking about. So as I mentioned, trauma doesn't just occur firsthand, it can occur secondarily, and it can also occur vicariously. So secondarily could be me witnessing something that happened to someone else. That didn't happen to me, but just by me witnessing it, I can actually walk away with trauma symptoms. Vicariously, which we're going to talk more about, vicariously means just by listening to you talk about your trauma story, I can have trauma symptoms. So that's how prevalent trauma symptoms are in our bodies and in our mind, is that we don't actually have to have been experiencing that. Just by seeing it or hearing it, it can give signals to our mind that we're actually going through a trauma experience of our own. And that really helps to like highlight that public health perspective of how prevalent trauma is in our society. Mm-hmm. Yes. So as we start to talk about vicarious trauma, I believe that as service providers, all of us at some point in our career are going to experience vicarious trauma. I think that's just the nature of our work. And some of us are more likely to experience vicarious trauma. So some of those things that may place us at a higher risk of vicarious trauma would be if we've had our own trauma story. Right? Or if we work with a lot of people that have trauma stories, we're even more likely to experience vicarious trauma. And part of what we're going to talk about in a little bit is that it can be hard to like try to separate that. It can be hard to separate what's my trauma versus what someone else's trauma is. And that's part of those nuanced layers that we're talking about, is that our bodies actually can't tell the difference. Our body can't actually tell the difference between was I in this experience or was it someone else, because it's giving the same signals to our brain chemistry. So I want to break down different types of trauma. So on the very basic level, there's the trauma exposure. The trauma exposure is either the thing or things that happened to you, the thing or things that you witnessed, or the thing or things that you hear, right? So the exposure to trauma. The next two types of trauma that I'm going to be talking about are clinical traumas. And when I say clinical trauma, I'm talking about the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. We're now on the 5th edition, and this book is what therapists, psychologists use to diagnose people. Within the DSM-5, clinically speaking, there's, for the most part, two major types of clinical trauma. It can be helpful to understand how the DSM, what the criteria is that the DSM uses to diagnose trauma. And what we also know is that the DSM is really problematic in lots of different ways. One of the ways that it's problematic when it comes to talk about trauma is that it's really limiting. As a therapist myself, I worked with many kids that had very significant trauma experiences and trauma symptoms that didn't fit the diagnostic criteria for trauma. So just because the DSM doesn't say that it's trauma doesn't mean that it's not trauma. And it's still important for us to understand the criteria that they use, but I just want to encourage us to not limit it. Just because the DSM doesn't say it doesn't mean that in our interventions, it's not an important part of our treatment. So the first major one that the DSM talks about is acute stress disorder. I'm not going to read the slide, I'm just going to kind of talk about it, and you can refer to the slide for more detail. But in general, acute stress disorder is a set of symptoms that occur within 30 days upon trauma exposure. One of the specific things about the DSM in diagnosing trauma is that there's a very limited way that they define what trauma is. So when they're looking at trauma, they're really looking at an impact to someone's physical safety or their life. Like, you have to feel like your life is in jeopardy. That's like one of the defining criteria. So for acute stress disorder, the symptoms that come along with the trauma exposure have to occur within the first 30 days. Some of the symptoms: difficulty concentrating, feeling detached from their bodies, experience the world as unreal or dreamlike, having a difficulty recalling specific details of the traumatic event, disassociation. One of the things that we know across the board for trauma is that the earlier someone receives intervention, the higher likelihood that there's going to be a better prognosis. So with acute stress disorder, within those first 30 days, if we can really intervene and help support someone, that has a higher likelihood of like them having a higher success of like having those symptoms go away or reduced at least. One of the more popular forms of diagnostics for trauma is post-traumatic stress disorder. Post-traumatic stress disorder is really similar to acute stress, except it lasts longer than 30 days. So there's still the same having experienced or witnessed a traumatic or terrifying event in which serious physical harm occurred or was threatening. Some of the symptoms: intense fear, helplessness or horror, shock, anger, nervousness, fear, and even guilt. PTSD as a diagnosis was originally developed based on people that had gone into combat war. So it was the definition of it and the diagnosis of it was developed for a very specific population. Now that's not the only population that it can experience a diagnosis of PTSD, but I just want to give that context, because that's kind of the context that it was developed. Also, from a cultural perspective, we want to remember that the DSM as a diagnostic manual historically was created by white upper class men. And because of that, the application of it can be a little bit challenging when we're working with communities that aren't white. I've been able to use the PTSD diagnosis with some of the people that I work with in the community, but there's way more people that I've worked with that experience trauma that don't fit this exact diagnosis. So I just want to keep repeating that. Just because it's not in there doesn't invalidate the fact that it's trauma for that person. Any thoughts or questions? I was going to call on you, but you were just scratching your head. It's okay. I was like, you! Yeah, no. Yeah. Hurry up. All right. So we have trauma exposure, we have acute stress, we have PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Those post-traumatic stress disorder, acute stress, pretty much ends the diagnostic portion of our conversation. There's one more diagnosis in the DSM-5 for those of you all that are in diagnosing positions. It's under like the V code section. It is a lot broader than those two diagnoses that I'm talking about up here, but it's kind of more limiting in other ways. So I'm not going to go too much into that, but those two are the major ones. In addition to that, outside of the DSM manual, we have complex trauma. DSM-5 is the most recent manual that we use for diagnosis. Prior to that, complex trauma was actually being considered as a possible diagnosis to be added, but it wasn't added to DSM-5, so we'll see if it's added in the future. What complex trauma is and what complex trauma talks about is the multi-layered experiences that we're starting to talk about in our training today. Complex trauma refers to, unlike PTSD, which was geared towards singular trauma, Complex trauma is something, a concept, because it's not a diagnosis, a concept that we use to refer to people who mostly in childhood experience layers on top of layers on top of layers of trauma. More often than not, this is going to be multiple ACEs from that slide. In addition to that, oftentimes we're talking about community trauma, we're talking about cultural trauma, we're talking about institutional racism. Like there's layers on top of layers on top of layers when we start to talk about complex trauma. And what we now understand about complex trauma is that when we start to look at symptoms, and we're going to get to that, there's a different way that complex trauma feels than when we're looking at singular trauma. So when we start to look at the symptoms, when we're working with someone that's experienced complex trauma, oftentimes it's like multiple layers of those experiences, those symptoms. And just to give you like a little sneak preview to the future of what we're going to be talking about, some of the symptoms, we're talking about like literally how it changes your brain chemistry. We're talking about like an inability to be able to like self-regulate. Right, at a fundamental level, an inability to be able to self-regulate. And not because on the outside it looks like you're defiant and you just don't want to, but because on the inside, your brain has been on overdrive trying to survive, that you don't have the skills to self-regulate. When we talk about self-regulating, when we talk about trauma, and we go back to that slide that says trauma overwhelms your ability to cope. So it overwhelms your ability to cope. In the moment, what I like to talk about is that our bodies, when we strip everything away, we're animals. And on an animalistic, primitive level, our number one goal is to survive, right? And so if you are exposed to trauma after trauma after trauma, your body is in constant survival mode. And so your body gets to the point when that happens over and over and over again, when you are not being exposed to trauma, your body, because it's constantly now in like survival mode. And so when it's time to like chill, right, you can't regulate that. Your body's amped up. You're energetically in like fight or flight mode all the time. And so that's part of what we're seeing with complex trauma. The symptoms that we're going to be talking about refer to things that aren't complex trauma too, but just remember that it's just more complex when we talk about complex trauma. So in addition to all of that, there's also trauma that's specific to someone's culture. So cultural trauma is a direct result of cultural isms. And it can take many forms. So we're going to break down the many forms of cultural trauma. But part of what I want to mention before we even go into that section is that cultural trauma cannot exist without larger forms of system of oppression that help to support its existence. So I'm just going to repeat that one more time because that's really important. That cultural trauma cannot exist without the larger systemic forms of oppression that support it. So when I talk about larger systemic forms of oppression that support it, the three main ones, but unfortunately there's like a long list of cultural oppressions, but the three main ones that I want to highlight are the role of white supremacy, the role of patriarchy, and the role of capitalism. So, and I want to remember that as we're talking about this, this is so much bigger than any one person. When we're talking about systems of oppression that support cultural trauma, it's systematic, it's macro, it's so much bigger than even this room, this building, this city, this country. It's so much bigger than this point in time, right? Because part of what we're talking about is also historical as well. When we're talking about white supremacy, patriarchy, and capitalism, it's also about an ideology. It's about an ideology that in this society, in a lot of societies across the world, supports this idea that a certain way of being and looking is better than, right? And when we talk about like specifically white supremacy as a form of like cultural oppression, what we're talking about is that in this society, white has become synonymous with what is like better than. And that is about skin color and colorism, but even more than that, it's about a way of thinking. It's about how in our institutions, even what would you say, the ideology, the belief and value system of whiteness has permeated our systems of being. When you look at even our educational system and you look at what our kids are taught, we look at our history books, we look at our textbooks, all of that is very white-centric. So when we're talking about systems of oppression and we're talking about the impact that that has on someone under white supremacy that isn't white, that in and of itself is a form of trauma. Growing up in a society that devalues who you are based on your skin, based on your family beliefs and values, that is a form of trauma. It's a different form of trauma than physical assault, but what that does to our spirit and what that does to ourselves as we're developing is a form of trauma. And the same goes with patriarchy and capitalism. And they're so deeply interconnected with each other that depending on who you are in this world, your spirit is being assaulted on a regular daily basis just based on your cultural identities. And so just going back to that whole first part of what I was saying a little bit ago is that cultural trauma cannot exist without these systemic forms of oppression that support it. So I want to pause there for a second because I think that's kind of a lot to digest. And I just want to open it up for people's like comments, thoughts, reactions of like what you might be thinking as I'm starting to talk through some of this. Yes.
I agree with everything you're saying. And I do appreciate you going into the depths of trauma. And I've been to many, share with the folks that are listening from their offices. Oh, sure. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Sorry to cut you off. I'm sorry.
You was doing it. You was there. You was flowing.
As I was saying, they can hear me? Okay. I appreciate you going in depths of what trauma is because I know through my clinical background and education and experience, but at the same time, I've been to numerous trainings and they tend to be on the very surface of what trauma is and stay with the traditional, typical, but you're tapping into real stuff, relevant stuff, and stuff that definitely affects us today, whether it's through work or you personally. So yeah, like I said, I appreciate the layers and levels that you're going into it, and I definitely agree. And some people, if they probably haven't heard of it, they're probably going to go back or look, or even scenarios are probably coming in their head as you're sharing, whether it's with themselves personally or with their clients. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I'd like to add something to this.
Yes.
I like the description right here, but I also think one of the things that
I think one of the things that was left out was religion.
Yes.
Because religion has been used as a tool against people of color.
Yes.
And it's funny because I was watching an old Phil Donahue thing, and they were talking about this white Jesus. And then they were asking the audience that was predominantly white, what if Jesus was not white? And then they had the people of color saying, and he was not white, And it's funny how the people, the predominantly white group that was in the audience were getting really upset, and the ones that weren't or tried to act like they weren't upset were saying, well, it doesn't matter what color he is, But the point is, what if he wasn't white?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, thank you. And there could be many, many others on this list. And sometimes they intersect back to white supremacy, patriarchy, and capitalism. So even when we talk about religion and we talk about religion persecution, oftentimes that's also rooted in whiteness and white supremacy. But that doesn't mean that it's not noteworthy, right? There's also like systems of oppression that impact people's like sexuality, right? That impact like other parts of who we are that are equally as impactful as these. Yeah. And I just want to invite, like, as you were mentioning too, just notice, right? Like, as we're going throughout, like, the conversation, just notice, like, what happens for you? What happens, like, as you're listening? What parts of you feel activated? What parts of you feel numb? Because I think also our own bodies can be a tool to help us to understand this as well. And going back to the public health perspective, we're all impacted by it. Right? We live in this society. Because we live in this society, we're all impacted by these systems of oppression, no matter who we are in our identities. Even if we're of the privileged group, we're still impacted by it. Sometimes people, we talk about like privilege, right? Cultural privilege. Cultural privilege like gets people access to things, but we have to also remember that cultural privilege also comes at a cost, right? There's a cost, there's a loss to that as well. Any other comments or questions or anything before we move on? So just continuing on the cultural oppression piece, I just want to note that with cultural oppression, it doesn't just occur on any one level. It can occur on an individual level, and sometimes we only think about it on an individual level. But we have to remember that the individual level is only one piece. I, as a person, can have biases, and those biases impact the people that I work with. When I open my mouth and I say something based on that biased lens, that now has an interpersonal impact. It's not just that I'm thinking it, I'm now saying something that's impacting other people. I'm saying comments, I'm assessing, I'm filling out paperwork from my biased perspective. So it has an interpersonal impact. I then, with my biases, can be, promoted, and I can now be a director. I might now be like the president of a school. I might be the governor of a city. And with my biases, I'm now on an institutional level creating policy. And that then becomes societal. So there's so many different layers of how this cultural oppression plays out, and therefore so many layers in which we can experience cultural trauma, not just on this one-on-one level, right? It's almost as if, on some ways, the more harmful things happen at this institutional level. Right? Because it's the policies of the institution that are being created that keep people down in a lot of ways. So other types of trauma, cultural trauma, racial trauma. Racial trauma, although it's not in the DSM, there has been more and more studies and articles that have been published about specifically racial trauma and the symptoms connected to it. So this is one definition of racial trauma that was connected to a recent research article. So they define racial trauma, a form of race-based stress, refers to people of color and indigenous individuals' reactions to dangerous events and real or perceived experiences of racial discrimination. Such experiences may include threats of harm, humiliating and shameful events, and witnessing racial discrimination toward other POCI. Although similar to post-traumatic stress disorder, racial trauma is unique in that it involves ongoing individual and collective injuries due to exposure and re-exposure to race-based stress. That's a lot. And there's actually a lot of like really powerful sentences in this definition. So I'm just gonna take it back to you, and I just like to ask a couple, maybe two people, if you can tell me like what sentences stand out to you as you read this.
Such experiences may include threats of harm, harm and injury, humiliating and shaming events, and witnessing racial discrimination toward other people of color and indigenous people.
Yes, yes. Yeah. There's so much just in that sentence. And as we start to talk about, and this is, it's happening right now, and it's happened in different ways historically, but one of the things I want to highlight about this piece around witnessing racial discrimination, we witness that through the media. We witness that on Facebook, on Instagram, on the news. If you are not careful, you can literally be bombarded throughout the day with witnessing not just your own racial discrimination, but other people's. We're being inundated. Historically, that happened too, but it took the form of like pictures and publication in newspapers, which was traumatizing and not as inundating. So we talk about going back to trauma impacting our ability to cope. If we're constantly being exposed to this trauma material, there's like periods throughout the day where our ability to cope gets reduced. Stand out to anyone? Yes. Do you want to say anything about her? Just the
whole just collective injury.
Yes. Yes.
Just constant. You're in it constant, over and over again. And like you said, you see it in the news. You're the race, just with Black, Latino, the Indians. Indigenous people of America, you just see it constantly over and over again, and it can weigh you down just watching it on the news, and not just hearing it, just weighing you down. So
yes, absolutely. And I want to highlight a piece of what you're saying also is that racial trauma also is a type of trauma that oftentimes goes unrecognized. And when I say unrecognized, it's not diagnosable. You can't go to the doctor and say, my heart feels so weighed down because I've been watching this. My heart feels so weighed down because this is happening to people in my community, right? They're not going to give you a diagnosis for that. And because of that, I think in our society, what happens is that we just have to keep on keeping on, right? We're in survival mode. And we're in survival mode, but our hearts are hurting. So you have to go to work in survival mode with your heart hurting and still try to help and support other people, right? Which starts to like highlight the complexity of all of that.
How it talks about re-exposure.
Yes.
And how a lot of time with race-based stress, it can come from your own community.
Yes, yes.
And that continues to re-traumatize people. Especially as an African American, it definitely can come from your own community your entire life, depending on what shade you might be, or something like that.
Absolutely. Yeah. I really, really believe that it impacts all of us. I think for those of us that are racial minorities ourselves, and we're not talking statistical minority because that's a whole nother thing, right? But racial minority, we've internalized this. You can't help but to internalize it. But your job is to then figure out how have I internalized it and how do I heal those parts of myself so that I don't recreate what this system of oppression has taught me about myself and my people. And then for people that are of the privileged category, so racial privilege, we're talking about the closer to white you are, right? There's an internalization of that as well. And that internalization can come in the form of internalized entitlement if we're not careful of that, right? That the society has been created with you in mind. That's a form of entitlement. So how do we look within ourselves and like really be honest with ourselves so that we don't perpetuate this on that individual, interpersonal, or systemic level?
And I just wanted to also say that this is like so real because for black Blacks and us still talking about slavery, you hear people say, oh, you guys should be over slavery now. It was so long ago. We're not responsible for it. This generation isn't responsible for it. So why can't you get over it? You had a Black president. You know, we've moved past that. But this, you know, really shows, right? Really shows that, you know, it's in us, and we haven't had reparations yet, and we haven't had treatment for that trauma. You know, as soon as slavery was over, we went into the Reconstruction period, but nothing was really done, right? They were just planning for the next level, right, for the Jim Crow age. So it's still going on in different forms, even though it's not slavery anymore.
Absolutely. And we're talking about like the layers, right? And so if you have layer on top of layer on top of layer on top of layer, healing becomes hard. Because like, where do you even start your healing? Because you're constantly being re-traumatized. And luckily, not luckily, but there's some things we're going to talk about, right? Like there are some things that we can do, and we have to first understand like the scope of what we're working with.
You know, and my thoughts are, you know, I'm really thinking about the racial trauma, and my thoughts are that racial trauma, in many ways, it's hidden, and obviously it's also very violent, very in our face. But the work that I do, I work with our team, and it's coaching and modeling and some training, and when I'm working with the team, my message is also, when we go to these trainings, bring it back, not just to our team, but take it to the families, because that in and of itself is very empowering. Oh, this is why I'm feeling this way. But when I'm thinking of the racial trauma, I'm thinking of our team members, you know, and on this slide here, individual, interpersonal, institutional. So for all, you know, many people of color, triggers come, right? We are experiencing trauma on a daily basis, and one day someone says something or looks a different way, and it triggers something. So with teams that are out in the field and working, you know, in direct service and with families, something they may say or a way that they look or a response to something could trigger a family. And that trigger could be anger, or it could be, you know, a feeling of oppression, all of those. And I think it's just really important. This is so important that we continue this conversation. It's absolutely critical with teams and with providers who are working in the communities of color, so that they really understand the importance of being careful what you say, how you carry yourself, and knowing history and understanding the levels of trauma and racial trauma, because sometimes service providers don't really understand ACEs and don't really understand trauma, but in their heart, and it's a beautiful thing, in our compassion and want to work with families, but don't really take the time to fully understand the complexities of what the families are going through. And yeah, I just wanted to share that. I'm very appreciative of the racial trauma.
We'll take one more, but before we go, I just want to kind of add on to what you're saying also, that my belief or my perspective around it is that we have to start with ourselves first before we could tap into someone else. And I think that's part of what you're describing, is that it can be so painful to look at these parts of ourselves that we just subconsciously stay in survival mode and don't pause to like unpack our own stuff. And ultimately, I think that's one of the biggest gifts that we can offer the people that we work with, is to do our own stuff, is to look at our own layers, to like work with that, find our root, find our resilience, so that we can model that for them. Because we can't help them go to their depths if we don't even know how to go to our own. And it's hard. We'll take one more.
To piggyback on what you were saying, it's not just the persons who are in positions of privilege that need to understand this. It's people, black and brown people as well. Because if we don't understand, we're taught to just stuff it in and keep it moving. And if we don't understand that that's not normal, we are also exposing the people that we are trying to service to injury. because we have, just like you said, we haven't dealt with it ourselves. So it's everyone's responsibility to understand racial trauma, not just other folks. It's all of us, because we can all do injury when we're trying to do service.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you. Thank you all. Check the time. So, of trauma that are culturally related. The first one I want to talk about is historical trauma. So historical trauma and intergenerational trauma are really similar. So I'm going to kind of talk about them a little bit connected, but I want to talk about the differences. So historical trauma, well, let me give you some examples. Historical trauma examples include slavery with African American people, genocide of indigenous people, oppression and famine with Irish Catholics, Holocaust with Jewish people, internment camps with Japanese Americans here in the United States, and the list can go on and on and on. So historical trauma is a type of trauma that impacts a large group of people in any one period of time. And that because that trauma occurred to that large group of people in that given period of time, pretty much everyone of that cultural group in that time was traumatized. And there's theory and thought that historical trauma is passed down. Historical trauma is passed down not only in terms of the narrative in the story, because that's part of the trauma, but it's also passed down in terms of like institutional oppression. How that overlaps with intergenerational trauma is that intergenerational trauma, we're looking a little bit more explicitly at the impact of that trauma, right? So during times of slavery, that trauma had an impact on African and African Americans at that time. And when I say it had an impact, it impacted how they coped, impacted their brain chemistry, it impacted like really deep parts of themselves. Not only did it impact that generation, but for me, being 5 generations removed from slavery in the United States, I still carry that blood inside of me. I can't separate myself from my great-great-great-grandma's trauma that occurred in slavery here in the United States. I may not be able to like take a microscope and look within myself to be able to tell you what layer is what layer, but I know that she lives on in me. And that's part of intergenerational trauma. There's now research, and I always like, I'm a little sarcastic about research, so I'll just tell you that because you might notice some tone. Because I'm sarcastic about it because research sometimes catches up with what we've always known. And then because of white supremacy, once a research article is published, it then validates what we've been knowing all along. So that's the tone that I take with it. But research now shows that intergenerational trauma is real. Research now shows that that there's you're able to actually see through like lab tests, through like animal testing, the interconnection between a mama's trauma and the baby's trauma, right? And so there's some really interesting work out there that you could read up on, and we already know that. We already know that historical trauma is real. We already know that intergenerational trauma is real. And so when we're working specifically and talking about slavery in African American communities, to deny that that had an impact on what's happening currently and contemporarily in the community, particularly in the intersection of capitalism, and we start to look at our poor communities, it's hard to argue that it doesn't have an impact from this perspective. And for me, it also starts to like make that onion that much bigger, right? So that as I'm thinking about the people that I work with, and I think about my job is not only to hold them, but to also think about like, there's also this part of their great-great-grandma that's in the room too. And that even though we're not working with that person, like there's something in the room, there's something in this person that also is carrying that trauma as well. Actually, the other thing I want to say about that, going back to like white supremacy as an ideology, one of the things that white supremacy as an ideology teaches is individualism. And individualism is actually in the exact opposite of collectivistic ways of beings that many communities of color operate from, even on a primitive kind of like, what do you call it? Like a primitive, like on a spiritual connected level. So when we start to talk about something like historical trauma and intergenerational trauma, we also understand that from a collective perspective. Right? That from a collectivistic perspective, of course, I'm connected to my great-great-grandmother, even if white supremacy ideology tries to tell me that I'm an individual and that what happened with her doesn't impact me. Like, we challenge against that notion. I think we already talked about do I have any more? Yeah, so racial trauma, we talked about, and just noting that the other isms, right? So there's racism, there's homophobia, there's isms against people based on their abilities, based on their gender. Like, there's lots of different forms of isms that impact someone on this like trauma level that we're talking about. And from an intersectional lens, and we're talking about cultural identity, some people have multiple targets against them in this realm. So not only are they a person of color, but they're also a sexual minority and a gender minority, and they're poor, right? So based on all of those intersections of their identity, they're being targeted based on all of that together. Poverty. Oftentimes we don't talk about poverty as a form of trauma. I like to vote that poverty is a form of trauma, right? And so to think about people that are living in chronic states of poverty, that has an impact. And oftentimes from this lens, what we're talking about in terms of poverty, it's not situational poverty. Situational poverty can be traumatic. Situational poverty is you lose your job. Something happens, you have a huge like health crisis, and there's a situation that causes poverty. That is a form of trauma, but more of what we're talking about here is intergenerational poverty. And what we know about intergenerational poverty is that it's not just about the money. It's not just about not having access to a check. It's actually also about not knowing how to navigate capitalism in our society. Not having been taught how to save, how to invest, how to budget, how to like plan for the future, because part of what intergenerational poverty does is that it reinforces the living in the moment and the survival. So if you're constantly having to focus on survival, you ain't gonna be thinking about next year, right? And whether X, Y, and Z is gonna be taken care of for next year. And that also has a way of perpetuating the poverty cycle, which is then reinforced by these systems of oppression that we're talking about. And so it almost has this feeling, the metaphor that just came to my head is like being on a hamster wheel and just constantly spinning and spinning and spinning and spinning and never being able to slow down. And on a physiological basis, that's almost like what's happening with us when we're in a constant state of trauma, is that we're that hamster wheel. Our physiology is constantly spinning, it's constantly in survival. We're constantly scanning to make sure that everything's okay. It's really hard to be in this moment because I'm thinking about what happened yesterday. I'm thinking about if such and such is okay. I'm trying to think about how I'm gonna get home or what corner I'm gonna take. There's a lot happening, right? That's just making that hamster wheel keep spinning. Community trauma. We kind of touched on this a little bit, but it's also that collectivistic piece, right? Is that like to live in a community where there's a lot of trauma happening, even if you're not directly experiencing that trauma, that has an impact on you, right? A current real life example is that we're hearing about ICE raids, right? On a national level and on a local level, we're hearing about these raids that are happening in communities. You don't even have to be undocumented or not have papers to be traumatized by that, right? That's community trauma. Even just hearing about that possibility signals your body to go into survival mode, right? And to live in a community where that is rampant, just that one example has a community trauma impact to it. Because from a collectivistic perspective, we understand that we're all connected in some way. And cultural specific emotional abuse. Right? There's so many ways in which emotional abuse is rampant, but then we throw in culturally specific emotional abuse, being called a name, right? Being called out of your name. Having somebody even like criticize my hair. Like, why are you talking about my hair right now? That's emotionally abusive, right? Like, there's so many forms of emotional abuse that happen on a cultural level that, again, oftentimes go unnoticed. Even for ourselves, even for myself, just speaking from the sometimes I don't even notice, or I notice like a day later, or I'm in bed getting ready to go to sleep, and I'm like, what? Like, did they say that earlier? Because in the moment, I'm just like focused. I'm doing what I'm doing. And so it didn't even permeate, but it did permeate because I'm thinking about it at 12 o'clock at night. And then I'm thinking about all the things that I could have said, didn't say. And it's a lot, right? And also a lot to say something all the time, right? And so to not say something, to say something, even just that loop of like, when do you stand up for yourself or someone else can be exhausting. We call that emotional labor. Right? And there's a disproportionate amount of emotional labor that people of color experience in society because of how much we're navigating in all of this. So the last one I want to talk about before we go to break, which I've already mentioned, is that, actually, I'm going to pause. Going back to the cultural traumas. Does anyone have any other thoughts about the cultural trauma before I just mentioned vicarious?
I'm wondering if, I know we talked about how like social media can
Yeah.
Is there a way in which you, is there a way in which you think it could help, like, because the things that you were talking about when you were lying in bed and it occurs to you, I know that a lot of people tweet about that. That's how I become aware of these kinds of things, like these microaggressions or whatever. I'm just wondering if you think that could be healing in a way, or
I think it's
how
such
social media could be used positively, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's such an individual journey that like you have to find what's going to work for you, right? And so some people, social media is actually like an outlet of empowerment. There's this thing, if people haven't heard, called Black Twitter. And Black Twitter is, to me, hilarious. And that's like a really good like uplifter for me, because Black Twitter like hits on people and they're really like no nonsense. And so I like reading that. That like causes me to smile and feel really good. Whereas like other forums, I'm like, I can't handle it. It's too much. Whereas other people like post and that's their form of empowerment. I know other people for their social media where they only accept certain people on their friend requests. They only follow certain sites on their friend requests. And so it's more controlled in that way. So I think you really have to find like what's going to work for you, and to understand that also because all of our traumas are different, all of our intersections of what this looks like is different, our path to healing around it is also look very different. And so kind of connected to that is that this piece around vicarious trauma. So in addition to all of what I just talked about, there's also this piece that as service providers, there's vicarious trauma. You have your own story, you have your own experiences, you have your own narrative. From a public health perspective, we can assume that every person in this room has experienced some form of trauma. And in addition to that, vicarious trauma is real. So vicarious trauma, by definition, is a transformation of the helper's inner experience resulting from empathetic engagement with client's trauma material. There's books and books and books on this, so we could talk about like a whole training just on vicarious traumatization and the symptoms of it. But in basic, what I like to describe is that we are energetic beings. That's just the nature of part of who we are. Most of us, if not all of us, in the helping profession are also empathetic beings. What it means to be empathetic on an energetic level is that you are open to someone. So energetically, as you're listening, you're opening yourself up to them. And that's part of the healing process, empathy, and really truly being there for someone. And when we open ourselves up, we receive some of their stuff. And that's what vicarious trauma is that when you're focused on trauma material and they're talking to you about their trauma material, it's safe to assume that you're gonna like take on a little bit of that. and it's energy that you're taking on. And so sometimes that energy feels like at the end of the day, you're just really, really exhausted. Sometimes at the end of the day, you come home and you don't even feel like you have anything left to give to your kids. Other times it could be like all of a sudden you want to go to happy hour 5 days a week after work, right? You just really feeling like you need to have that. 5 days might be a little too much. There might be something else going on in that, right? Other times it could be more significant, where people can actually start to have nightmares, where you could actually start to have flashbacks. 2 stories of my own from vicarious trauma. One happened after I was talking to a young girl many years ago about a physical altercation that she had gotten into. And she actually flipped up on her phone a video of the altercation. And I said that like some of us have different baselines around vicarious trauma. For me, I can't watch fights. Like I'm not UFC, I can't do any of that stuff. I looked up and I looked at it and I was kind of stuck on it for like however many seconds. Looked away, asked her to put her phone away, and day kept moving. A couple days later, I started having flashbacks of like the scene that she showed me in the film. And it took me a couple days to be able to like release it. Another form of vicarious trauma came for me like really early on in my career, where I had this narrative that I wasn't going to have kids. I now have a 4.5-year-old son, so fast forward. But my narrative was I don't want kids. I don't want to bring kids into this world. If I ever decide to have children, I'm going to adopt, because there's a lot of children out here that are already here that need homes. But I don't personally want to bring a child in this world. As that, like I started to like do my own work, what I realized is that vicarious trauma, I had been exposed so much to like the dark parts of society that there's this part of me that has shut down. Like I don't want to bring a kid into this world where all of these things happened. And so part of my journey and my own healing around this element is needing to have balance. So needing to have balance in my job, but like it's not healthy for me to do jobs where like 100% of what I do is like up in the trenches, listening to this stuff all day, every day. It's too much for me to be able to balance that and actually be able to have a healthy life outside of that. So all of us are going to have our own solutions for what works for us, but that's just kind of a sneak peek. So after break, what we're going to do is we're going to build on all of this that we've talked about and start to look at the symptoms of trauma. And then we're going to wrap up with like trauma-informed care and what that looks like. So it's 10:25 right now. We'll take a 15-minute break and then we'll come back. To your trauma exposure. And that's part of what we're seeing with the ACEs, but know that those types of symptoms expand past just the ACEs category. The other piece that we know to be true about people that experience trauma at an early age is that it actually, I want to say changes, but sometimes it's not even about changes. It creates a different perspective about the world, or it changes your perspective about the world. So these are 5 basic assumptions that youth that experience trauma may have about the world. So 1, the world is not a safe place. 2, I have no control over what happens to me. 3, everyone is a threat to me. 4, I deserve all the bad things that happen to me. 5, I have no control over my body. So I want to remind you that these are basic assumptions that one might have about the world. What that does not mean is it does not mean that they have a t-shirt on that is walking around saying, the world is not a safe place, or I believe the world is not a safe place. These are core beliefs about the world that are ingrained in that person. So now let's talk about what might that look like on the outside. So starting with number 1, the world is not a safe place. If we were to imagine someone that had that core assumption about the world, what might their behavior look like, or what might we notice from the outside? Any thoughts? Isolation, not trusting anyone. Assertive or aggressive behavior. Jumpy behavior. So from the outside, these types of things are all we see. We don't see that core belief about the world. I deserve all the bad things that happen to me. What might that look like from the outside? Always thinking negative about stuff. Indulging in risky behaviors. I don't give an F attitude. Say it again. Self-harm. Absolutely. So just these core assumptions, there's so many different ways that they can look on the outside that it really does take, one, the conceptualization of understanding that trauma causes one to have these worldviews, but then two, as you're connecting, depending on what your work is and what your job is, sometimes we start to understand people's worldview by the conversations that we have with them. We start to get clues about what their perspective might be. And part of the challenge is, how do we help them to have a different narrative, a different belief? And this is, and part of what we're going to talk about later is the power of positive relationships. If that's all we can do is to build a positive relationship with someone, that in and of itself has profound impact on people. So let's say, for example, everyone is a threat to me. If that is my core belief in life, and that is a belief that has been reinforced over and over and over again, what then happens for me if I have you as a service provider? What then happens for me if every single week, maybe sometimes multiple times a week, I get to sit with someone that unconditionally believes in me and would never hurt me physically or emotionally, that actually cares authentically about me? Even if nothing else changes, what happens for that person, one, assuming they can believe it and that they can receive that from you, is that it gives them one exception. And sometimes one exception is all someone needs to believe that there are exceptions out there. And we're going to go into that in a more nuanced way, because there's also a way that we have to be aware of building trust with someone that has experienced complex trauma. Because remember, part of this survival mode is, survival mode is strength-based. Survival mode is what is helping that person to get through all of this. So it would be unhealthy for us to expect for us to walk into a room and they're going to automatically trust us, right? That's not healthy for them. If you have been hurt over and over and over again, not trusting someone is a really healthy coping skill that we want to have you keep. But part of what we want to teach is discernment, right? And how can we take our time in these relationships and really build a strong foundation of trust? So not only are we creating that exception, but we're also helping them to teach and model for them how to build healthy relationships, and the difference between a healthy relationship and a not healthy relationship. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes. Mm-hmm. 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 Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. One of the strategies we're going to talk about around that is around transparency, and really making sure that you are being realistic with yourself, and that you're using that realistic with yourself to create transparency for them. So something simple around that is that I answer my work phone between 8 and 5 every day, as an example. But being really transparent with them up front around that this is the parameter of the relationship, so that they understand that as they're building relationship with you, this is the parameter in which that exists. So if they call you at 7, and you don't answer their phone, they're less likely to receive that as you don't care about me. But also with transparency, consistency and reliability is also really important. You say, I answer my phone between 8 and 5, they call at 7, you answer your phone that one time, but you don't answer your phone the next time, you've now disrupted that. Because now you're showing them that you're going to bend boundaries. And sometimes, more often than not, we bend boundaries as providers because we care, because we're empathetic, we want to help, but that can actually create confusion for our clients. Part of what our clients need that have experienced complex trauma, they need structure, they need consistency, they need reliability, and they need transparency. And so even though, you know, they may call you, right, if that's not part of what you've set for them, then you get back to them next day. So like little things like that, that can be hard, but it's important to build that foundation, and we'll build off of that. So in addition to these basic assumptions that we're talking about, going back to this primitive side of who we are and this piece around survival, this piece about survival is even happening on a biochemical level. So on a biochemical level, when we are introduced with some type of trauma exposure, something that our bodies recognize as a trauma exposure, what my body recognizes as a trauma exposure may be different than what your body recognizes as a trauma exposure. But once we experience a trauma exposure, usually one of three things happen: fight, fight, or freeze. Fight, flight, or freeze, right? Your body might change it up, but usually you're going to have like a dominant type. Fight, on the outside, we fight. Flight, I'm getting out of here. Freeze could actually look like disassociation. It can look like they're just like not even there, right? Sometimes from a biochemical level, like that's part of the disassociation that's happening to like help us to be able to survive whatever's happening to us in that moment. And what we want to remember about this biochemical part of who we are with complex trauma, because with complex trauma, there's repeated trauma exposures, your brain can be chronically in a state of fight, flight, or freeze. So even when you're not being exposed to a trauma, your brain can be almost stuck there. And so it's oftentimes, from a diagnostic perspective, we talk about ADHD and trauma being differential diagnoses, meaning the symptoms of ADHD and trauma could actually look really similar sometimes for some people. If you're chronically in fight mode, it's going to be really hard for you to sit still and listen in a classroom and do what you all are doing right now. Right? Your body's got the jitters. There's something going on in you that's telling you, like, it's probably not actually telling you, you probably have no conscious awareness of it, but you feel it in your body. So, however, there is a normal period of adjustment, and most symptoms of trauma exposure include feelings of upset, disequilibrium, and overwhelm. So when we were talking about the different types of trauma, we're talking about like with diagnostic, like you have 30 days, 60 days. Sometimes you're going to go through your fight, flight, or freeze response, and then you're going to cycle through it. And it's a healthy flow of cycling through that might not actually result in some of the other symptoms that we're talking about on a long-term basis. However, with people that have experienced complex trauma, we can assume that there's going to be like those long-term symptoms, but with like one trauma exposure, you may not actually go into these next layers of what we're talking about. So with complex trauma, and we're starting to talk about more long-term symptoms, what those symptoms could include: physiology. It could impact your emotions, your ability to think, learn, and concentrate, impulse control, self-image, and relationship with others. Over the course of a lifespan, it can include problems like addiction, chronic physical conditions, depression and anxiety, self-harming behaviors, and other psychiatric disorders. Right? So there's so many different layers of what the symptoms could look like. And a lot of people that we're working with, it's going to be like multiple parts of this. When we start to get into this second part, especially around addiction, it's really hard to think about like what comes first, the trauma or the addiction. I think oftentimes the addiction is a way of trying to cope with the trauma. And because of that, it's another survival skill. So again, strength-based, they're trying to cope, they're trying to survive. And that survival technique is what we call maladaptive. It's not the most healthiest thing in the world, so we want to try to help them to find a more healthier alternative to surviving. And in this moment, they are alive. In this moment, they're trying, right? People with addiction aren't necessarily suicidal, right? It's not that they don't want to live, they just don't want to live in pain. And the type of pain that we're talking about that comes with complex trauma, it's, it could be physical, but it's that emotional pain that we're talking about that's harder to get rid of. It's harder for it to go away. So in essence, there are 7 domains that we're looking at when we're looking at the impact of trauma. We're looking at attachment, biology, affect regulation, disassociation, behavior control, cognition, and self-concept. Affect regulation, I'm just going to give you an example of a couple of them. Affect regulation, oftentimes, this can look differently in different ways, but a common way that we see that is constant flat face. They're telling you about their most exciting, happiest story, and they still got flat face. There's like no affect regulation there. Or maybe the opposite. They're always smiling, even when they're talking about something that like brings sadness to their heart. But there's no like affect regulation that's happening there. The disassociation piece is huge. Sometimes you can't tell, sometimes you can tell when someone's disassociating. There's this blankness that happens in their eyes. Like you can look at someone and all of a sudden their spark goes away. You can tell their mind is somewhere else. Other times with disassociation, you're looking at someone, you think they're there with you and they're not even there. They have become so good at surviving that they can like physically be present, give you eye contact, make it seem like they listen in, but meanwhile their mind has like literally gone to another place. Any questions about any of these domains? Yes. They're trying to get you to be quiet. Yes, yes. Another common one, which is, I mean, there's so many layers to this that some of this could be other things besides trauma. So none of what I'm saying is necessarily exclusive to trauma, but these are just some of the things that we tend to see, is like, especially around the self-concept, the cognition piece, like, I don't know, or I don't care, right? Is it that you don't know, or is it that you don't believe in yourself enough to be able to like speak that out loud? Is it that you don't care, or did you have to train yourself not to care in order to avoid chronic disappointment? So with all of that, basically what this slide says is that with all of that, what we also know is that our brain can actually, at any moment in time, can be reshaped and reprogrammed. And because of that, that brings hope to the field of trauma. What makes it harder is that people are being exposed over and over and over again, and there's things that we can do to try to create different lasting impact on people on a biochemical perspective. Even if that's just for the like 1 hour, 2 hours that you're with them, that 1 hour, 2 hours can help to like alleviate something so that they have that extra space in order to have to go out there and be exposed all over again. And sometimes that's what our work is about providing that space where people can land, they can be held, they can release, they can be seen, right? We talk about racial trauma and the role of not being seen in this society. to like be in front of someone that truly sees you is huge and can have a lasting impact. So I want to talk about trauma-informed principles, and I want to talk about how to adapt that to what we're talking about. I'm going to go over 2 slides right now that's going to talk about the trauma-informed principles, and then I'm going to kind of incorporate some cultural humility stuff in there, and then we're going to do some small group reflections around it. So there are 6 key principles to trauma-informed practices. So when you're thinking about what can I do with or for the people that I serve, you want to make sure that what you're doing is rooted in some way in some of these principles, if not all of these principles, at least some of them. Safety. At the very basic level, when we're talking about safety, I'm talking about not hurting your client. Right? Don't physically hurt your client, don't emotionally hurt your client, don't sexually hurt your client, do not hurt your client. Safety. And we're also talking about emotional safety. When we're talking about emotional safety, that gets into a whole other kind of can of worms metaphorically. Because emotional safety is about some of the things that we were talking about earlier. So emotional safety is about when someone meets you for the first time, how do we not create an environment where that person is going to tell us all of their deepest, darkest secrets when all I said was, hi, my name is Taquelia, right? That flooding that can happen isn't safe for them. It's hard because sometimes by the nature of our jobs, we have to like ask intake questions that actually ask them to talk about some of the stuff, which isn't very trauma-informed, and it's connected to our billing systems and all of this other stuff that's rooted in white supremacy ideology, but that's a whole nother training. But it's about like how to hold all of that, right? Like how do we hold that I have this like 8-page intake that I need to ask you all these questions for, while also understanding that like it is not safe for you to disclose all of this stuff to me right now. How do I hold both of those? And part of how I hold that is by incorporating the second one around trustworthiness and transparency. The piece around transparency is huge. Transparency is explaining what you're going to do before you do it and while you're doing it. And it is huge to creating safety. Because part of trauma is taking away your ability to, your control over yourself. In this space, I want you to have control. In this space, I want you to know and understand what's going to happen. So when you first come in and I have to ask you a 15-page, is now gone to a 15-page intake. You saw that went from 8 to 15. So now I have to ask you a 15-page intake. I'm going to talk to you about that beforehand. And I'm going to explain to you why. And I'm going to also model for you that like if you don't feel comfortable in this moment answering some of these questions, we can revisit them, right? I'm going to set that stage. For me, as a licensed clinical social worker, social work has implications to it. For me as a therapist, therapy has implications to it. So how am I talking about all of that in a transparent way during that first session? How am I talking about confidentiality and its limits as a form of transparency, right? You have to be transparent because that builds the safety. The other pieces that I was talking about helps build safety, reliability, consistency. As much as possible, if you say you're going to do something, you have to follow through with what you say you're going to do. And if you can't do it, go back to the transparency. Don't leave them hanging. Right? All of that basic stuff helps to create a container of safety for them to be able to trust, right? If you say, you know, I'm going to be there at this time to pick you up, be there at that time to pick you up. Be careful what you say. Be careful what you put out there, because all of that is so connected to this basic structure that you're trying to create with them. And it also builds into the trustworthiness. Peer support, as much as possible, and this kind of goes a little bit to your question as well, as much as possible, we don't want our clients or the people that we're serving to only have us in their life. That is not a healthy dynamic. When we're talking about complex trauma, what we're also understanding is that their needs are so complex and so huge that it would be like silly of me to think that I'm going to be able to serve all of that. So who are peer communities that they can connect to? Are there peer partners? Are there local organizations? Are there church communities? Are there elders in their community? Who else can be sources of support for this person so that we're not trying to hold all of this in and of ourselves? And I can also tell you that for me, and this is different for all of us, but for me, because of my own trauma and knowing what I've been through, knowing what my family has been through, knowing what my community has been through, my default is to like try to like do it all, right? Like my default is like to try to take on like as many clients on my caseload as I can, to like go to all the places and be all the things. And that's not healthy for me, right? Because I have to be able to balance myself and be okay in all this. But it's also not healthy for them. It's not, what happens if something happens to me? What happens if I get another job, right? Like it's not a healthy dynamic in that way. Yes. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Live and move to a different area,
Mm-hmm.
and you don't want them to be so dependent.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
In reality, you're facilitating them,
Mm-hmm.
empowering them to have the skills to live their life.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And that last piece is so important, right? Like our job, which is the empowerment, voice, and choice. Our job, with as many degrees and credentials as I have and as much money as I spent on all these papers and initials after my name, I'm still not the expert, right? I think when I was younger, I thought that like when I got my master's, I was going to be the expert in the room, right? And that's part of the next slide too, is cultural humility, is that like I've humbled myself and to know that like I'm not even an expert on myself, right? I'm striving to be an expert of myself, but that takes like everyday learning and growing. That how dare I think I'm going to be an expert for someone else's situation? That's not my job, right? Part of my job in this and part of our job is to partner, right? It's like, how do we partner with people to try to help them and to be by their side? And I have some things I can show you, right? Some things that I've learned along the way, but we need to be in partnership with this. And that's the empowerment piece. How do we empower the people that we're working with to have voice and to feel like they have choice? And that is incredibly hard, period, but also incredibly hard because of the systems of oppression that we're talking about. Part of the natural consequence of these systems of oppression is that it disempowers, right? It takes away choice. It takes away voice. Our communities of color, our youth of color are growing up in a society that wants them to believe that their voice does not matter. How do we create an alternative to that, even if it's just when they're in our office, but hopefully there's ripple effects in that, right? Because to have that empowerment, that voice, and that choice is huge. A simple example of that is never ask someone to sign something without talking to them about what it is. Asking them to read it, translating it for them. And I'm not talking about translating from Spanish to English, although that is a part of it, but translating from legal jargon to like 56th Street talk, right? Like, how do you translate so that people really fully are informed, right? Informed choice, informed decision, informed consent. And that's part of that transparency. Most of the people that I work with trust me so much that they would literally sign anything that I put in front of them. And sometimes, because I got 5,000 things that I gotta do, that would be the easier route to take. And that's not healthy for them, right? I need to take my time in this. I need to explain and go through this process. And the last piece is around cultural, historical, and gender issues. Understanding that in order to do trauma-informed care, you have to incorporate culture. It is not trauma-informed care if you're not using a culturally nuanced lens. Those two things have to be intimately linked together. So when we're talking about culture and using a culturally nuanced lens, there's just a couple things that I want to highlight. One, before we used to talk a lot about cultural competency. Cultural competency is still a term that we use, but it's starting to be more outdated. What cultural competency tried to teach us was that there was like a destination of knowledge that you would get, and then you were competent in culture. It used to be something that you could put on your resume. It used to be something that you can go to workshops and get certificates for, but that really is an illusion, because the reality is that you will never be competent in culture. And so while that's still a term that we use, what we now want to focus on, instead of just focusing on competency, we want to focus on cultural humility. And there's 3 parts to cultural humility. Cultural humility, 1, increasing self-awareness of one's own biases and perceptions. It has to start there. Going back to what we were talking about earlier around this piece that we are all socialized under these systems of oppression, and because of that, we're all impacted. So we have to take the time out to look within ourselves, even when that feels hard, to like really unpack this for ourselves. It's understanding that this is a lifelong process, which for me sometimes can bring like some anxiety, because like I want to know the answers, I want to get it right, I want to be right, I want to be good, and that's not going to happen all the time, right? That when it comes to working from a cultural perspective, the reality is that I'm not going to always get it right. Sometimes I'm going to say something that's going to be a microaggression against someone else, even with my best intentions. Sometimes I'm going to do something that's going to be insulting and hurtful, even with my best intentions. And so how do I humble myself around that? How do I accept feedback? How do I apologize and mean it? And how do I, even bigger than that, commit to doing better and commit to constantly learning and growing? And the last piece is about being the learner, not the expert, but the learner. So as we're thinking about kind of that last piece of trauma-informed care, and we're thinking about like this culturally nuanced piece, what I want to pose is that, 1, I'm going to talk about the first 2, and then I'm going to ask you to reflect on the third one. So what does it mean to embody cultural humility versus cultural competency? So what I mean by that is when we embody something, it's more than just our head. You can be the most intellectual person in the world, but if you have not figured out how to embody it, you're not going to be able to connect with the community. The community cares less about how much knowledge you have and more about your ability to be able to like be real and to be able to like be there with them. And the knowledge is important, but we don't demonstrate our knowledge by showing them our test results. We demonstrate our knowledge by how we embody these principles. And so that's what I want you to be thinking about. So to embody cultural competency oftentimes looks like telling people facts, right? It's this, is that, I know this, I know that. I don't know why my voice changes, but somehow that's like the energy that I come across. And is that it is patriarchy? I don't know what it is, yeah. So like, it's like that energy, right? Like that's not how you embody this, right? And that's the cultural humility piece, is like, how do I embody? Even if I'm just giving someone eye contact, how do I embody this? How do I embody in my eyes? How do I embody in my spirit that not only am I striving to learn and to grow and be competent, even though I never is going to fully happen, but how do I also humble myself in these moments? And that's what we're like thinking about. How do you embody both of them? So what I'm going to be asking you to do for about, let's say 5 minutes, I'm going to ask you to do another pair share. And I'm going to ask you to really reflect on this first one, or the third one, sorry, number 3. What is one thing that you can do or continue to do to embody this way of being? And when I say this way of being, what I mean is like the both of them, right? To embody cultural humility and cultural competency. What could that look like for you? And for our online people, I think we're going to have them just talk amongst themselves and see if you can answer this question together. And then I'm going to ask a couple of people just to share out what are some things that you either do or could do to help to embody both of these. And then from there, we're going to do another small group reflection. So 5 minutes. So before we transition into the next segment, I just want to ask about 3 to 4 people that would feel comfortable just like sharing super briefly, what is the one thing that you can do? And it's not just going to be like one word, I'm sure, but anything that you can share that's brief.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I'd like to share just something from Beth, and you know, one of the things that she's doing, she's very conscious of equities and inequities with her team, and she is working really hard to bring different groups in for trainings and introducing different thoughts to her team as they're working with communities of color and, you know, communities in and of themselves. She works for First Five. And I think that, and what I was saying to her is, you know, on some level, it's very courageous because we work so hard so fast that oftentimes we're doing the same things, either because they work or because I don't have time to learn to, or the bandwidth to do something different. And so it is sort of that cycle.
Definitely.
And then here, you know, with Beth, she's sort of throwing that pebble in and saying, yes, we've been doing it this way, but let's learn more and perhaps bring on some new techniques, some new thoughts, some different ways of working with the communities that we work with. And I just thought that was beautiful.
That's great. Yes. One thing that I'll say about that is that if you're interested, you can look it up online, but there's a great little article looking at how white supremacy ideology manifests in an organizational culture. And there's a list of different things that we tend to see in an organizational culture. And one of the things that we see in organizations is a chronic sense of urgency. And what happens with a chronic sense of urgency is that it doesn't allow time or space to slow down, to be able to have the layers of conversations that we're talking about. And so part of what you're doing is dismantling white supremacy at an organizational level, which is so deep, right? Even just by slowing down, even just by helping people to build connection with each other is a way of dismantling white supremacy on an organizational level. And going back to one of the slides, is that we have to assume that white supremacy appears in our organizational structures because that's part of what it was built off of. And so the article, you can Google it, but it has like just like line items of like 10 to 15 things that we see within an organization, and it'll probably ring true to a lot of you.
So one of the things with cultural humility is bringing the actual people that you're trying to serve into the conversation early. So if you're planning something, if you're planning a program, if you're planning a new curriculum, the people that you're trying to serve are the experts. So you bring their conversation, their voice, their suggestions into the space at the planning stage, not when you're finished planning and then this is what we're going to do for you. They need to be incorporated.
Absolutely. Yeah. Maybe one or two more.
So one of the things that we both talked about with regard to like how do you try to embody both cultural humility and cultural competency was around working with children. At Girls Inc. we work with school age girls. And knowing where my trauma comes from with regard to the relationship that adults have with children, I'm very intentional about just the way that I even will look at the girls or speak to them. And I'm intentional about like listening first before I tell them, oh, this is what might be wrong, right? Or making sure that they are just, you know, they might just be hungry. So do you need some food? Do you want to lay down? Like it doesn't always have to be sit down, be quiet, go do this, go do this. You know, in my culture and my generation, it was like kids are not seen, they're not heard, they're just there doing whatever the adult has told them to do. And so what I find the kids really need is someone who takes the opposite approach and who really embodies someone who cares about them. And that doesn't mean that you know, then try to become their parent, but you can be an advocate. And you can listen to what they say, like really listen, like not be on your computer when you're talking to them, or not be on your phone, or not be dealing with 5 other things when you're talking to a child. And so, yeah, and so we both had instances where that really helps us to understand that, like, this child is not being lazy. They're not being whatever we like to say about millennials or children or whatever. It's really what I went through, but maybe, you know, on some other stuff. And it's really, you know, it helps to remember what it's like to be 7 and feel like you don't have a voice. And so, like, lifting up their voices and helping them to understand that you do matter and what you say matters. It's the same thing with adults. Like, I was telling her, I've seen the difference in a child when they understand that they can trust you and you're safe. And I've seen that difference in adults as well. Like, there's this wall that comes down when they realize, okay, you're an advocate, you're an ally. So it has to be very intentional, because there's even moments when I catch myself being like, girl, bye. You know, you go do, you fine, whatever. And so you have to be really intentional and remember, like, you know, what would help you to trust someone.
Absolutely. I want to give you all kinds of snaps. Yes, that was good. That was good. And I want to add to that also that one of the things that we didn't talk about that's important to name in the context of what you're describing is that trauma also has a way of stunting us, meaning stunting us developmentally or developmentally. So you could have experienced trauma, complex trauma from 4 to 10. You might now be 57. But developmentally and emotionally, you might still be developmentally 10, right? And so some of what you're describing, it doesn't just end in childhood, right? Just because someone is of a later age doesn't mean that their trauma narrative has caught up to their age in that way. And we start to talk about things like emotional intelligence, or being able to, like, emotionally regulate. In order to emotionally regulate, someone has to first to be able to understand what are emotions. What are these called? What do these feel like, so that I can even start to regulate them?
I just wanted to, listening to what a neighbor said, and then speaking with my neighbor here, is that with the cultural humility and the cultural competency, is that we become the curriculum ourselves to reflect on ourselves, but also the people that we work with, they're our curriculum to study as well. I remember when I was teaching, my husband's always say, teaching is just intensify learning. And in order to teach them, we have to learn them as well. So I just wanted to add that.
I love it. Yeah. Is there an online? Perfect. I just want to say, before we go into there, we're starting to, like, naturally bleed into this next one. And so I think what we'll do is just keep the conversation going for another 5 to 10 minutes. And people are already starting to answer this. And so we'll go there and then open it up. But I want to also start to, like, look at what are strategies that you can do that help to, like, name some of those trauma-informed principles that we were talking about. So even just in what folks have already started to name, not only is that cultural humility, but also when we look back at this slide right here, you're checking off some of this, right? You're talking about how to build safety. You're talking about transparency. You're talking about empowerment, voice, and choice. So I just want to encourage people, as you're bringing comments to the large group, if there's other examples of things that you've done to help to highlight some of these trauma-informed principles, I'd love to hear.
Okay, Najib, we're ready for you if you're ready to make your audio comment.
Yeah, this is Najib. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Awesome, great. So, yeah, I just had a quick comment about just the concept of cultural humility. You know, one thing that I think is a critical piece that we tend to kind of miss at times is the institutional accountability that's associated with cultural humility. And, you know, what I mean by that is more like the concepts of self-reflection or critical self-reflection and lifelong learning. How does an institution encourage that, build a culture and environment that allows for that, and then also looks at itself as how is it with its policies, procedures, practices, perpetuating the isms and the discrimination. And so I think that's one piece that's really important that we, especially those of us who work in agencies and institutions, have to keep in mind. You know, it's not just at the individual, let's say, staff person or worker level, but what are those things, the structures in place, and how do we kind of pause and critically look at the way things are always done and how we need to change that. So just wanted to bring that piece up.
Absolutely. Thank you. That's a really good point. And I want to add to that, that what you're describing not only impacts the communities that we're serving, but it also impacts those of us that are working in the institutions, right? So as we're talking about burnout, we're talking about vicarious trauma, we're talking about turnover, we're talking about representation, right, within institutions, all of that contributes, right? Depending on what institution that you're talking about, it could be really common, even still today, to have less people of color working within an organization, or have a higher turnover rate within certain organizations because of exactly what you're describing. And so as we're talking about dismantling white supremacy on an organizational level, white supremacy, patriarchy, capitalism, right, we have to be looking at that. And especially for those of us that hold positionality in the room, so for people that are directors, for people that are CEOs, like that are really up there, that have positional power, this is like a call to action in that way. Because oftentimes what we see is that it's the people that are working on the ground level that are trying to do exactly what you're saying. They're trying to dismantle the system. They're trying to change organizational culture. They're trying to find voice empowerment for themselves and others, while they're also out here trying to hold all of the stuff that's happening in the community. And that's too much, right? So how do we have the people that actually have positional power be at the table so that they're the ones that are actually consciously working toward dismantling and creating these changes you're talking about?
Hi. So Nikki and I were really talking about like the humility piece and how kind of difficult it is to incorporate that. Like even if you have a PhD in Native American culture, you're working with a Native American family, that might inform it, but it doesn't really speak to their experience necessarily, or like the complexity of what they've experienced. And it's taken me personally, I mean, my grandparents are Holocaust survivors, and I think was raised like I have this trauma and like I get it, you know, but not really realizing like, no, I'm white. I grew up, you know, relatively wealthy, well educated, and not really thinking about my privilege, like really wanting to focus on, you know, this like small piece of my identity, which is like this inherited trauma, or the fact that I'm a woman, and how difficult it is to actually think about, wait, no, I do come from a position of privilege and power, and really taking a step back and recognizing that that does inform like how I see the world and how I treat people. And I mean, that goes back to lifelong learning, but I think it's hard to kind of like put that into practice and kind of say like, well, where do my biases come from? And like, how am I privileged? I think it's a lot easier to say like, oh, I get it. Like, I'm like you. And you kind of want to do that.
Absolutely.
And it's hard to kind of be humble about that.
Absolutely. And there's, you know, it sounds, in some ways it can sound like a little like twisted or backwards, but I think what you're saying is like right on. Like part of what we see, part of what I see in my work is that, well, one, all of us embody both elements of privilege and oppression, right? Intersectionality. We are all complex identity beings. And some of us have more identities that are targeted for oppression than we do that are targeted for privilege, right? So there's that piece of it. And what we see almost across the board is that when you're having conversations with people about culture, it's almost always easier to talk about the parts of our identity that we've experienced oppression than it is to talk about our identities that we experience privilege. And so that is just an interesting thing that I notice. And I think they're both hard to talk about. But until, especially when we're talking about patriarchy and white supremacy, and until you're able to really do that work, it's going to be a deflection to talk about the other parts of your identity. And I think the goal is, how do you embody all of it? How do you see yourself as a cultural identity being that has all of these parts of yourself? How do you hold your oppression in your gender identity with the privilege of your skin color? How do you hold your immigration story with having documentation, right? Like how do you hold all of this complexity within yourself? Because if you can't hold it within yourself, you're not going to be able to sit with someone else as they're like talking about it. Do I need a snap? Yes, thank you. I like getting snaps. What time are we? Okay, we have maybe time for one or two more comments as it relates to anything that you do around this or anything around culture, humility, competency.
I know I spoke already, but with the safety piece, it's important to let folks know before they start speaking that you're a mandated reporter.
Yes.
So that the safety, trustworthiness, and transparency, when you were talking about, they want, especially if somebody, a Black or brown person, it has not had the opportunity to work with another Black or brown person, and they see you for the first time, and it's somebody that looks like them, and they feel that they can just let it all out. Before they get that first word out, I'm a mandated reporter, so that they can pull back and choose what they say.
Absolutely. And that can feel really complex, right? Because on one hand, we could have a whole thing about mandated reporting and white supremacy, so I'm going to try to make it simple. But on one hand, we want to make sure that people are safe. We want to make sure the children in particular in our communities are safe, right? So we're holding that, and we're also holding this piece of wanting to connect and help, right? And we're mandated reporters. So from a transparency perspective, in giving people that information, if they choose to not disclose something to you, there's transparency there, right? They might still choose to disclose. Sometimes people actually don't even realize they want help until they open their mouth and ask for it in other ways, right? So some people I've worked with as providers that I'm supervising, it feels complex, right? Well, what if I tell them I'm a mandated reporter and it makes them not tell me the truth of what's happening? It's their story. It's their narrative, empowerment, choice, and voice, right? Not telling them you're a mandated reporter feels like you're tricking them. Even if that's not your intention, it feels like you're tricking them. And so transparency around that is really important. And hopefully through the structure, the consistency, the reliability, they're going to be able to trust you. We'll take one more comment. Yeah.
And one thing I've learned, in addition to my educational background, is just to always be true to myself and just to be authentic and genuine and trust your gut, because I've been in a clinical setting and workplace, and you do have these papers. Just knowing a time and place, when to pull them out, how to just be an effective listener, which is sometimes harder than you think. But you can go back at the end of the session or after, and like you said, they start to just have conversation. There might be resistance at first, but they might go into a whole story that you can go back afterwards and pull out this board and all these papers. A lot of them don't trust. They've been in police settings or CPS settings, all kind of settings where it's very formal, with a person with a suit on and a clipboard talking this clinical jargon or textbook jargon, and just checking, you know, right in front of them, that have put them in situations where they didn't trust or feel safe. So just being mindful of that and meeting them where they're at. And like I said, trusting your gut, of course, informed consent, and then not just saying I'm a mandated reporter, but telling them why, you know,
and what it means.
And what it means, you know, just really breaking it down, like you were saying, and try to just put yourself in that woman's or child's or whomever's shoes, and just trusting your gut, and you'll get it done. And sometimes you can get all those papers won't get filled out to about 3 sessions or something, 3 or 4 sessions, but just knowing that's okay. And again, it's just building rapport and remembering kind of that you're probably not the first person they sat down with. And like I said, just your own little instinct, trust your gut.
Absolutely. Thank you. The one thing I want to say about that before we move on to the last couple of slides is that just also connecting that to white supremacy, because I talk about white supremacy a lot, but also like what it teaches us, like when we talk about the ideology, it has this way of like things become, what do you call, masked in whiteness. So something like the word professional is so loaded with white supremacy. And so as you're talking about something like trust your gut or be authentic, those things are really important. And sometimes what happens is that we're taught that if we trust our gut or if we are authentic, that is not equivalent to professional. And that's not necessarily true. Sometimes it could be true. Other times, it's not that it's true, it's that you're actually talking in a way or walking in a way or wearing your hair in a way or doing something like you were just saying in a way that isn't protocol, right? Or it's not professional. And so really unpacking some of that within an organizational setting to like make sure that you're not just like blanket statements around what is considered to be professional, because that is not a universal word. Professional dressing, like there's so many things that are loaded with that are different for different cultural groups. We want to create space for people to be able to be authentic, for people to be able to like have their like swag as they're working with people in a way that's also deemed to be professional, because oftentimes that's our instinct telling us like we're connecting, right? It doesn't mean that you're using like you know, there's still parameters around what we're looking at, but there's this authenticity that you cannot, it's like the core of it. Right? We talk about something like hypervigilance, which I didn't name, but hypervigilance is a symptom of trauma. Hypervigilance is like our body, our nervous system, I can't think of my words right now, but we're like constantly looking around, right? We're hypervigilant. We're making sure that there's not a risk to our safety anywhere around us. The other side of hypervigilance is being able to read people like that. Right? The kids that I work with, they can smell fakeness from a block away. They can just like look at you and they just know, right? They just got that like sense about them. So like the biggest thing that I can do is be authentic, right? And sometimes I laugh, but sometimes you guys see it, like people will work in certain communities and all of a sudden their tone of voice changes in a way that's not authentic. Or they get an accent that they didn't have in the audience, or they didn't have when they're at home. It's just something that they're trying, like a costume they're putting on. That's not what our community needs. They need you to be authentic in who you are, even if that's so different than who they are, to be able to own that, right? And to be able to, from that place of authenticity, show that you care. That's where it happens. You don't have to be anything that you're not. Right? They need you to be who you are, to do your work, and to show up from that place of genuinely caring. And once you stop genuinely caring, it's time to go find another job, right? Because sometimes burnout leads us to to apathy, and that happens. But notice that within yourself, because when you start to show up from a place of apathy, they're going to interpret that as something's wrong with them. Okay, so I don't have very much time, so I'm going to just highlight a couple things. There are just a couple of like intervention suggestions or ideas that I wanted to give you. Let me see, I'm gonna pick 2. So there's a lot on here, but I'm gonna pick 2 to focus on. Okay, so the importance of holding space. So holding space is a lot of what we've been talking about. Holding space is something that happens on an energetic layer, right? Holding space is about the container that we create, and it's about being present with someone and just holding that, right? Sometimes holding space is also being silent and not saying anything. So there's so many different ways that energetically holding space could be like a huge intervention for what you're doing with your clients. What else do I want to highlight? There's this piece around regulation that's really important in our work around trauma. Sometimes what we're teaching is regulation. You can teach self-regulation, emotion regulation through mindfulness exercises. Remember that if you're doing mindfulness exercises, don't ask people to close their eyes. From a trauma-informed perspective, that's a no-go. You can invite people to close their eyes or keep their eyes open, but give them choice, right? And also know that mindfulness, meditation, etc., has been culturally appropriated, but has been around since the beginning of time. And so on a energetic spiritual level, mindfulness practices actually can resonate with lots of different cultural groups. It's just about how you present it and the types of things that you choose. Playing basketball can be a mindfulness exercise. Mindfulness is allowing your mind to be fully present in this moment. To dribble a ball, you got to be with that ball, right? So there's lots of mindfulness things that you can do that are considered to be a little non-traditional, but that are really actually self-regulation techniques. There's other piece about mindfulness that I'll end on that connects with a lot of what we're talking about. So I'm kind of stressing the importance of relationship building. There's this piece around mindfulness that's also about attunement. Attunement is the person that you're working with. It's a term that we often talk about with babies, right? When a baby is crying, and you place them onto your skin, they can regulate themselves based on just being on your skin and hearing your heartbeat, right? That type of attunement can actually happen with all ages. I can attune with someone from across the room, right? If someone's starting to amp up, if I amp up with them, we're gonna keep having an amp up party, right? We're gonna be through the ceiling because we're both getting hyped, we're both amped. Versus if I can be grounded, if I can be rooted, if I can stay calm and regulated, even as they're amping, if we have a good relationship with each other, they're going to be able to attune to me in those moments, unless something extreme is happening. But using yourself as an instrument in all of this can be really helpful as well. So that's a lot of information. There's some other kind of notes on here about interventions that you can feel free to read over on your time. You all have the evaluations. Do we have time for a couple questions and answers? Yeah. Does anyone have any questions before I wrap up or comments or anything? I'll be here for we still have 10 minutes, and so we can just go ahead and wrap up, and then if you have more questions, you can feel free. But that is the end of my presentation. It's a lot of information, so I just encourage you to notice within yourself what you find yourself thinking about for the rest of the day. Notice just what comes up for you, and just also know that this is a overview, and so any of this stuff that you want to learn or understand more about, you can easily find information about it online. So thank you all so much. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Taquelia. So that's all we have for you today. You all have evaluations in front of you. Please do complete them. We want your feedback. Again, this is all going to inform our learning communities moving forward. Please go to our website, strategiesca.org, sign up for our newsletter so that you stay connected and apprised of future events. And if you did not sign in, please do so so that we can stay connected to you via email as well. Anybody else have anything else to add? I think that's it. Oh.
Thank you. For those of you that didn't get a chance to meet me, my name is Carol Carrillo. I'm the Executive Director of the Child Abuse Prevention Council for Contra Costa. We actually have the contract with Strategies 2.0 to be providing the learning communities, and we've been working with Deborah and Lana I've been working with Deborah for the last year, been working with Lana for the last 2 or 3 years. This is Lana's last learning communities with the Bay Area, so I really want to recognize her and thank her for all the support and just always being there for us and making this a smooth sort of process for us, because we do have the hub sites and then we're trying to engage the whole Bay Area with our satellite offices, our trainings, and it's just been really great to have you working with us. So thank you. And I also want to thank Deborah for the last year working with us in Contra Costa to engage the whole Bay Area in our learning communities. And we're looking forward to another year of learning communities and doing more of this sort of work, you know, and hearing from all of you of what you feel the needs are. What do we need to be focusing on? What are some of our needs in our communities that we can learn more about to do better work and with our strengthening families work in the communities Bay Area wide. So please take the time to fill out your evaluations. We mentioned it earlier that we do take your comments seriously, and we really want to do sort of craft this next year with our learning communities in a way that's really meaningful and beneficial to all of our work. So thank you all again for being here. And Michael, did you want to say anything else? Or oh.
You said it very nicely. Yes, well, I'm very much going to miss Deborah and Lana. Lana's going the other side of the country. Deborah's coming up to Sacramento near us, and we get to connect there. And just this year has really made such a difference for the Bay Area, and you all have. It's been an amazing privilege to be part of this conversation, and that we all made it happen. So thank you.